without further ado, guys, we're going to get to our keynote speaker. It's Matt Manocherian. Matt has been a friend for a long time for me. Matt actually did a really interesting piece about the post-draft process, the undrafted free agent process, and we put an interview on the site a couple years ago. And Matt was with the Browns and the Saints, and so he knows what it is to be an area scout, to do the traditional work of evaluation and all those kinds of things. But he also went and got his degree from Columbia, no shabby university, and now he's in the analytics field. He's with Sports Info Solutions. Those of you who know who Bill James is, or maybe who saw Moneyball, understand basically what analytics and metrics are, and have some idea of the direction that they're taking in pro sports. They already have baseball completely locked down. I think they've kind of dipped their toe in the water in basketball, and football's their next frontier. So I wanted to get Matt in here to answer questions, because I've always thought, well, hey, football is a completely different animal from baseball. It's not nearly as cut and dried. It's not a sport that lends itself to analytics the way that Sports on the Diamond does. But Matt has a different take on that, and that's why we brought him in here, to just kind of give us a new perspective on these kind of things. So without further ado, I'll let Matt come on up. By the way, each of you have a sheet with the questions that Matt will be answering, so you can kind of follow along. After he's done, we'll have a Q&A as well. Thanks, Matt.
Excuse me just for a second.
I can get that out of here.
It's all good. Hey everybody.
Hey, what's going on?
What's going on? All right, I'll try to keep this a little bit lively and not get too boring with you right now. We're talking about football, so it's fun stuff for me. Before we start, let's start off. I gotta come clean. I don't like stats. I've never liked stats. I've never been a stat guy. I will take offense if you call me an analytics guy. I'm a football guy. I played, coached, and scouted at various levels. I love the game, not the numbers. But that said, the numbers can teach us about the game a little bit. That said, if you were expecting somebody that was going to tell you that analytics is going to replace scouting and that you should forget about all that, or if you should make any individual decision about your team based on the scouting information that's available to you, you came to the wrong symposium. I would never advocate either of those things. I think analytics without scouting is idiotic, and I use that word with all that it connotes. And I think anybody who ever makes a rational decision in life realizes that there are contextual factors that you need to take account for. We can't just take a game like football, especially in a game like football where it's emotional and it's human. I would argue that team and cultural factors within the team have an outsized importance that they do in a lot of other areas, especially other sports. And I say all of this to just reiterate how much the analytics can help, but that's not the end game. The end game is making football better with the analytics, not any sort of a replacement or any sort of, oh, this coach made this decision, it was wrong because the analytics said so. At the end of the day, analytics help football people make decisions and not the other way around. Also, if you're nervous that tonight's speech might have gotten a little bit too mathy, I'll try not to go too deep into the numbers. That'll not only help keep things simple, but I think also I might get fired if I gave away anything proprietary. So I'll try to keep my job. Neil asked me to start off with my story, kind of my background. So I'll talk about that a little bit. I grew up in New York outside the city. I played football growing up. I was a safety and a wide receiver. I was a decent player. I'd say damn good for a 5'9" Jewish kid. But you know, all league in the New York State area, football is not taking you playing high-level college football. So as bad as I begged my parents to let me go to Ohio Wesleyan because they sent me a letter, I got into Duke. I went to Duke, and that was the end of that conversation with my parents. As soon as I left Duke, of course, I came back and I started coaching high school football. When I left for Duke, I should say, I asked my coach, I said, hey, do you think I could walk on? He said, no, you're not playing football anymore. But I did come back to him after I graduated, and I asked him for a job right away out of school, and I started coaching the secondary and the wide receivers and getting into it that way. from there, I was looking for any in college football, pro, whatever it may be. And I got an internship with the Saints. So I went down there for a summer internship. I was 22, and I was with mostly college kids and a couple of high school kids doing the training camp intern. But I grinded my way through it. I tried to spend as much time as I could around the personnel office. And eventually they decided that they'd let me stick around. So that's kind of how I got into it. It was just kind of, I worked my way in as an intern. I did 2 years in-house with the Saints, with Mickey Loomis and Sean Payton. Those guys were running the thing down there. Had a great time. A lot of in-season pro stuff and a lot of off-season college stuff, which makes sense as kind of the workload goes. A lot of special teams, little BS things that nobody wants to do. They got handed down to me. And eventually they let me go on the road. I covered the Northeast as a college scout. And then a year after that, the Browns hired me. They had Mike Lombardi as their general manager at the time. And he hired me away from the Saints to have a better position, still Northeast area scout, but being, an official higher level scout, making a little more money. And it was a great opportunity because I thought Mike had a really good outlook on a lot of interesting things about the game. I don't know if any of you listen to Bill Simmons, but he's a frequent Bill Simmons guest. Anyway, I was with the Browns for a year. Mike got fired halfway through it, and things broke down a little bit, we'll say. By the end of my time there, things had fractured to the point where the scouts had one opinion about the draft, and the coaches had one opinion about the draft, and the analytics team had one opinion about the draft, and the owner decided we were going to do things a little bit differently than all of the consensus. So there wasn't a very good analytical process there. We ended up with a guy named Justin Gilbert in the first round, and then also Johnny Manziel. I was quickly out the door in Cleveland. They didn't see me as a fit going forward. I was okay with that, but I had to pick up my pieces and figure out my next step. So, one thing that I mentioned before I talk about my next step is being in both places. They had two very different styles of evaluation. And these are really the two different, this is kind of interesting, the archetypes that you see kind of across the NFL. So you get one system, the one I had in New Orleans, which is pretty much, what round is he worth? What is he? He's a 3rd round draft grade. What is he? He's a 6th round draft grade, free agent, right? We're used to talking this language. It's very old school. It's a good system. It's certainly, a lot of teams are still using it, so they haven't found anything better, at least in their opinion. What we learned in Cleveland was based on the same sort of program they're using in New England, Atlanta, teams like that, Kansas City from that tree. And what they do is actually a little bit interesting because as opposed to putting somebody into a grade, you say, what is this player going to be at his position? For example, if you're looking at a tackle, an offensive tackle prospect, is this guy going to be a left tackle only? Is he going to be a Pro Bowl level left tackle? Is he going to be a backup level left tackle? Is he a backup left tackle with right tackle swing flexibility? Is he a backup left tackle that can play either guard spot also? So there are all these different permutations of what he could be for your team. Where does he upgrade your roster? And the point is, that's what you got to deal with. When you're drafting, you're trying to upgrade your roster. And so Belichick and Lombardi, they originally developed this in the 90s, but this has become, I would say, in vogue with about half the teams, as far as my knowledge goes, based on people that I talk to and where people have moved around. In some places, you're even seeing combinations between the two, which I think there's value to as well, because sometimes there are a lot of different rounds that a third down running back could be worth drafting in. There are different players, so there are merits both ways. Either way, they're both really great ways to evaluate really interesting systems. There are problems, though. There are problems like evaluating the evaluators. How do you know which of your evaluators are good evaluators and bad evaluators when you got to wait 3 to 5 years to figure out which players you picked were going to be good? It's a very difficult process to figure out who's evaluating things consistently well, what positions they're good at, where you should assign them to what position they're going to do. So even at the highest level in the NFL, I was very frustrated by that in both locations, and to be honest, actually a little bit more so in New Orleans. So the other thing I'd say is that I think we all see that the process isn't perfect. I think everybody here has criticized the draft pick before. I think that there's about a 50% hit rate in most rounds of the draft, and that's atrocious. And in most businesses, everybody would get fired with a 50% hit rate with the amount of money that's at stake. So we can all see that. I was even joking around with somebody beforehand here saying, who would you trust more to call a football game? Your favorite team's offensive coordinator or IBM Watson? And for as much as we all want to criticize, oh, this game can't be made into that, it's too complicated in sports, maybe Watson could handle it. I might take him against some offensive coordinators. So anyway, after I left the league, how did I get into analytics and pursue a degree at Columbia? So I left the Browns. I'm splitting between a day job in the day, and I'm working for an agent, doing some scouting in the evenings, kind of trying to figure it out. And some months after that, I got word of an information session for a sports management program at Columbia University. Hey, it can't be the worst thing in the world. I'm from New York. It's the #2 program. They say, okay, I'll check it out. I go there. This guy, Vince Gennaro, he's the head of the program. He's the president of SABR, the Society for American Baseball Research, also sabermetrics, all that kind of stuff. He's there, and he starts talking about this program, and I start thinking, man, some of this stuff might make some of the processes we're doing a little bit better. So I picked up Moneyball, and I read Moneyball while I was on vacation shortly after that. And you should see that book. It's all doggy ears and Post-it notes, highlights, everything. There's so many ideas that I thought, baseball, you can't apply baseball stuff to football. How is that going to work? It's 1-on-9. You got every event is individualized, all that kind of stuff. Just out of that, you'd be surprised at how much stuff is applicable. Anybody who's seen the movie knows that a lot of the first stuff they found were that guys that didn't look like baseball players were being undervalued. Well, this is a really simple and easy way to take that out of the equation, all those sorts of biases. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. I got to know Vince Gennaro, the president of SABR, after I was really exploring going back to Columbia, and I decided it was a great idea. So I went back to the program, and I went to my first class, was baseball analytics, taught by Vince, and it was unbelievable because all of the things that are going on there, it was like a window into a sport where for 20 years, and really more if you take Bill James, how long he's been doing it since the 70s, but for 20 years in the mainstream, this has been something that they've been working on, and they've been advancing their systems and progressing. And to think that just because the sports are different, that there aren't a lot of things within the sports that are very similar processes in the way that they operate is frankly silly. And I think that'll be more and more the case, that's the consensus opinion as we go into the future. The curriculum at Columbia was awesome. We had classes on baseball analytics, basketball analytics, and soccer analytics. And through all of these, I learned more and more about how things could apply back to football. Basketball analytics, for example, they do great things with plus minus. You got 5 guys on the floor for each team. How well does each of those guys play when they're on the floor versus off the floor? Then what do you do after that? You take every 5x5 matchup that's getting played in the NBA in a season, take all those possessions, and you figure out when you shift one guy out, how does that change how good that lineup was relative to another lineup? And you take one guy on the other team, do the same thing, until you get every iteration of every team that played on the floor against each other in the year. And it turns out with machine learning, you can create a pretty good idea of who was responsible for the plus minus of the guys that were on the field throughout the year. So now, if LeBron James and I don't know who a bad player on the Cavs would be,
anybody else?
Whoever it is, they just got Andrew Bogut, so he hasn't played a minute. But say Andrew Bogut and LeBron were on the floor for every minute of the game. Okay, we can't tell the difference of who's making the difference to the team there, but A, that situation's pretty rare, especially in basketball. And B, I think we could all figure out that it probably had a little bit more to do with one of them than the other, based on contextual factors, which can never be ignored. And I think that'll be a recurring theme, that we don't want the numbers to just tell us something and we regurgitate it. We can learn to interpret these numbers to teach us things that we might not have previously realized. Soccer. Here's another sport that I think is even more difficult than football, where they've made tons of progress in. You got 11 on 11, just like football, but it's complete flow. There's no stoppages whatsoever. Everything is continuous, except for maybe a corner kick and a throw. Yet, they've been able to figure out all kinds of things like expected goal models and points above replacement and these sorts of things. And you're seeing soccer clubs all over the world that are using analytics to create an advantage, including Real Madrid, another club I don't know if you've heard of. So this stuff's really taken over in a lot of other sports, and there are a lot of things that translate back, even if it's not apples to apples. Apples and oranges do have things in common, right? So, how I got hired at Sports Info Solutions, Vince Gennaro from Sabre, he connected me with these guys. Sports Info Solutions used to be Baseball Info Solutions, and they've been in baseball analytics for 15 years. It was founded by John Dewan and Bill James. And Bill James, obviously, since long, long ago, has been gathering all kinds of baseball data, which is simple and straight to the point, all that kind of stuff. But they have gotten to a point where we've got 25 of the 30 major league teams as clients, including 9 of the 10 playoff teams last year and all of the Final Four. You look around and you see the Cubs and what they're doing with it. It's not just the small market teams anymore. It's really the big market teams with the big analytics that are really separating themselves from the rest of the league in a lot of cases. And with Sports Info Solutions specifically, I have 3 roles. I run the operation. We have 30 video scouts, and that number is going to be growing next year, who watch every NFL and NCAA game and chart various things that are going on every play. And I help lead that operation along with my colleague Dan, who's sitting over in the back over there. My second role is business development, and that's coming to talk to people like you and the various NFL teams that we're talking to this week and developing the product. We had our first NFL team partnership this year, which we were excited about, and only our second year doing football data. And they're helping us build some new things, and we're going to keep making those things available and pushing them out. And then my final role over there is research. And we're trying to push forward a lot of different things in the research sphere, because football data is starting to catch up, but football research is still lagging a little bit behind. And if this is anything like the baseball process over the last 15 years, and history tends to repeat itself, we are at a stage right now where we're just starting to find things, and we might think that it means something that 5 years later we find it means something else. So that's kind of the nature of the beast, but that's what I do. Anyway, before we get into the questions per se that we were going to talk about, which will go a little bit quicker, I think, than we had planned. I probably spent a little bit more time on introducing these concepts and who I am and the company, all that stuff. But I want to kind of challenge the notions of people that might think, okay, stats can't work in football, or I don't believe in this, to whatever level. So let's just agree on some things that stats can do. Now, in basketball, if you were trying to figure out what somebody's free throw percentage is, would you watch him shoot? Or I'd rather say, if you're trying to figure out how good a free throw shooter somebody is, would you watch him shoot? Or would you count the number of times that he made it in the basket? I think the better strategy is probably just to see what his free throw percentage is, and you'll have a pretty good idea of the percent chance that he's going to make that next free throw. Now, contextual factors. Man, he's got a janky release. You see that elbow sticking out. I don't know if that's sustainable. That's all real stuff. But when you get enough of a sample size, I don't want to see one video of a guy shooting free throws, and I can guarantee you that there are no NBA coaches watching videos of free throws unless they're the shooting coach doing a specific exercise. Similarly, if we're trying to look at field goals in the NFL, it's probably not the most important thing for people to look at how they kick the ball. There are little things as a scout that you pick up, the sound of it. You can look at the torque of the body as he's kicking the ball, the balance, things like that. Those are all really important, and they go into it. But how far was the kick, and did he make it? What was the weather, maybe? That's a pretty much a simpler way to look at the question. And believe it or not, this applies to other things. Like if a quarterback had 500 yards and 5 touchdowns as opposed to being 3 for 30 with 3 interceptions, you probably would say that one of the quarterbacks had a better day than the other. And I wouldn't really think that anybody was going to argue with that. So there are some things that we tend to accept, even if they're the limitations we're all kind of seeing there. Now, what these stats do, though, when we get better and more specific stats and get more granular than how many yards was the completion, and we say, what route did he run? Where was he at the catch point? What did he do after the catch? Did he break a tackle? Did he run out of bounds when he could have stayed in bounds? All these sorts of things. We can get a much bigger picture of the play, and when you have the data broken down to those levels, all of a sudden you can build it back up to create a true model of what's happening as opposed to that was a touchdown, that was a 10-yard gain. A really simple one that we added in a couple years ago that I think is colossally important to the way we evaluate quarterbacks on a very simple level is dropped interceptions. When a quarterback throws a ball that should be intercepted, we chart if it was a dropped interception. Yeah, the guy will get a PBU for getting in the way of the ball and being where he's supposed to be and all that kind of stuff. But a dropped interception is an important stat if you're trying to figure out a guy's quarterback rating, or even just his interception percentage, which is a component of quarterback rating. And sure enough, if you look at the guys that were at the top of the actual plus dropped interceptions last year, it's a lot of the guys that led the league in interceptions this year. And a much more predictive list than if you were to only look at the guys who actually were intercepted last year. So it's little things like that, but it gets out into bigger and bigger uses. The other thing is, stats can be good because none of us can watch every game. If we had infinite time and we could all watch every game of every player in the season and remember it, then you don't need stats because you're perfect. But even if I'm a GM and I've got a bunch of different scouts that are watching different players in different regions against different levels of competition, they're all going to have their own little biases and opinions. Even if we try to control for that with really good numbers and really good systems for processes, they're going to pop up. And if we can gather some stats that anybody could see that are truly objective, now all of a sudden we can get some real hard and fast information about all the players, and then maybe we can zero in on the players that we're more interested in. And it turns out that our data is really great for helping to create cutoffs of things like that. So stats can help. And one more thing that I'll say before we get into the questions is, how often does your intuition disagree with the consensus opinion? I think in most cases when we're talking about a player that we've seen on TV, if it's casual, I might have an opinion of what the player is, and I might hear the talking heads on ESPN and read a bunch of rankings lists and say, okay, that's their consensus of what his opinion is. Well, how do I know? A lot of scouts, they do some sort of system where they're saying, okay, this is what I think, but this is what I hear from my friends, and this is what I see on TV, so I'm going to give this grade. You get a pretty weak grade by doing things like that. The better way to do this would be to figure out what your opinion is, get an idea of what the consensus opinion is, and then also have some data to help settle the disputes. Because a lot of times the data can help sort out some of the things that you might be debating in deciding whatever it is, whatever the factors are that you're talking about with that player. So, we know SIS evaluates the first question. We evaluate college talent across the nation, the process. So, we've been in football for 2 years, as we said. We partnered with Football Outsiders, and we have their historical data, and they kind of got us started on our collection process. But right now, we're just at the tip of the iceberg. In terms of employees, we have 30 full-time and 30 to 36 video scouts, depending on what time of year it is. And one thing that we're really proud of relative to some of our competitors is that those guys are all in-house, and we have a big focus on scouting development. On the baseball side, we have a pretty well-known training system where guys can come into Sports Info Solutions. They do a season or two of charting our stuff and learning our systems and getting involved however they can. And they become ready-made, walk in the door, and baseball teams love to have them. And some guys have gone on to be so successful that we just had our first video scout who became a general manager. He's now the GM for the Tampa Bay Rays. So we have the same and maybe even more focus on the football side in terms of developing, because we not only have to recognize a slider from a cutter, which is something that I couldn't do, but we've got to teach these guys how to recognize the whole route tree, different formations, different stunts and fronts, techniques, all that kind of stuff. And there'll be varying languages that whatever they played growing up or whatever they're familiar with from watching or Madden even sometimes might be different terms than they're accustomed to. But we're trying to create that same thing where hopefully we can start throwing these guys into the league because they're developing the right skills to become top-notch scouts, especially in the way that the industry is going to move, we anticipate. So like I said, we're all in-house and we're located in Allentown, Pennsylvania. So if you're ever coming around the Allentown, Bethlehem area, please give me a call. You can pick up my card after the presentation. We watch every NFL and FBS game, regular season, postseason, all-star games, all that kind of stuff. And to watch a complete season of college football, it takes us 50,000 hours altogether. So we have several passes and audits that we do on all the data. There are a few times people go through the offense, the defense, and then we have checks against what people found against each other, and then against other box scores that we can find to make sure we're matching up with some other sources. And it's to the point where when we disagree with another source, we're absolutely positive that we're right and they're wrong. We have incredible geniuses in IT in our office who create these auditing programs that use various, I won't bore you with it, but there's about 40 different programs that get run after we score a game to make sure that everything's matching up to all the different sources, and it really helps us to ensure that we have the highest quality of data, not to mention having a senior scout go over all the games. What games do we not watch? Right now we do all NFL and FBS, and we can do any FCS, CFL, AFL, XFL, high school, or other game that you might request, if you give us money. Otherwise, we're doing NFL and FBS right now. And then what do we record? Well, we record everything from basic data, yards after contact, some things like that, to strategic factors, personnel, formations, play diagram. And then proprietary metrics, like we talked about dropped interceptions before, blown blocks. I don't want to get too deep into the ones that we want to hide from the rest of the world, because this is going to be on YouTube. But all three of those where they combine is what we do. And to explain a little bit more, because I have the feeling the question's going to come up about what's different about us from a certain other company. And besides that, we're not grading players, which is a big part of what we do. We're basing our stuff on real analysis. What we do when somewhat subjective data points come up is, as opposed to saying, this receiver made a great catch, we'll give him +2, or this guy had a drop, we'll give him -2. We say it was a great catch, and we have a definition of what a great catch is. Or we say it was a drop, as in an average player would be expected to make this catch 99% of the time, which I think is what our definition is on that. Dan can correct me. But if you create specific definitions for everything like that, for when an offensive lineman opens the door, it's not something that we see on a stat sheet right now, but it's something that anybody who's been privy to offensive line play can see when somebody takes a crappy drop and they get their quarterback killed. We can see why, and so that's when we start breaking down those components a little more, and that can help separate out a sack that was the left tackle's fault from a sack that was the quarterback's fault, which a surprising number of sacks are actually on the quarterback. Because you find when quarterbacks change offensive lines, they tend to bring their sack numbers with them, rather than the offensive line, depending on the quarterback, changing, keeping the sack numbers. Just a little interesting, weird thing that goes on that we probably wouldn't have discovered otherwise. So anyway, the stats that we do, we're from the Jamesian system of recording things, which is classifying plays as a certain way, classifying every event a certain way, defining it and recording it, and then using that to build models to figure out what the data means. I hope that makes sense, but that's about as mathy as I'll get with it. Question 2 is, SIS is a household name in MLB. How do you help bring Moneyball to all baseball teams, and what kind of services do you provide for baseball and basketball franchises today? So nothing to basketball, but yes, as you said, we work with 25 to 30 baseball teams. And how did this happen? So Bill James was recording sabermetrics forever. John Dewan, formerly of Stats, worked with him on making this more sustainable in like a team environment. And there were 2 things that really made it take off after they started it in 2001. One, it began helping teams win. Teams resisted it for a long time, but eventually, famously, the Oakland A's started outperforming their expectations, and other teams started picking up on it, and they realized this stuff works. The second big thing that happened is a book was written about it, and that book blew up to the point where there's a movie made about it, and all the teams realized that they were getting left in the dust if they didn't start to do something about this and do it fast. Most important, when it proved valuable, all of the teams had to have it, because if you were ignoring sabermetrics at that point, then you were behind, and it found out pretty quickly that it was hard to win that way. Now, to be fair, there were some teams that took the tact of saying, let's get rid of scouts and only rely on this stuff, and those teams fared even more poorly. So again, an example of let's take the contextual factors, let's rely on scouts. These are important people that need to make money, especially compared to the players' salaries. But that said, we can help them with good analytics, and especially if they can understand the analytics in their own evaluations. So some things that we've done in baseball that are pretty cool are things like defensive run saves, which is something that we're pretty famous for at this point. So defensive run saves basically says, at my position, whatever I'm playing, say I'm the left fielder, if there's a ball hit that I would be expected to field and I can't make the play, and it's expected to be fielded based on the trajectory of the ball, how far I was lined up from where it got hit to, the hang time in the air, et cetera, you can figure out what's an expected play, whether or not he makes the play that he's expected to make, and then literally how many runs that saves over the course of the game by factoring all these different little factors into whatever goes on. How do SIS metrics work is the third question. So we measure and record events, and we try to keep them as specific and objective as possible. As I just mentioned, that's the key to everything. We try to keep it to what a trainable eye can see. We train people that are familiar with football, that have experience, but it needs to be something that everybody can agree on, and they're not going to go saying, no, I think it was that guy's responsibility because they were in cover 2. No, I think it was that guy's because he blew the coverage. We're not going to know what's in the playbook and things like that, but there are a lot of things that we can tell that are going on that aren't captured in tackle stats. So we use these stats to calculate different rate stats, and then we're also creating models and performing regressions and to create predictive models for the future based on which of these things are going to hold up. And it's not too dissimilar to thinking about what Vegas uses to set betting lines. Not many people outperform Vegas, even though they might feel like they have the right answers. So the key really isn't manipulating stats, it's using the numbers that we have, gathering good data, and using it to let us teach us a lesson. What kinds of exciting ways can we evaluate players? On a team level, the thing that gets me most excited relates back to the NBA concept before we talk about plus minus. I think that the beginning of any play looks at how well did the play perform, which is a challenge to put a number on in itself, because it could be the yards that were gained, it could be whether or not it was a touchdown, an interception, how you compare a turnover, a fumble that your own team recovered. And basically what we have to do is figure out how successful the play was, and then by considering all those different events, figure out whose responsibility it was. And on a team level, you can do things like plus minus. So Earl Thomas was injured this year for the Seahawks. You can do a very simple plus minus where you say, plays with Earl Thomas on the field, give me every stat. Plays without Earl Thomas on the field, give me every stat. They're stark. If you're interested, I can share those with you later. But he's a really good player, and he had a big impact on the amount of points that the Seahawks were expected to give up over the course of each game that they played without him. On an individual level, there are stats like IQR, where we use dropped interceptions and drop passes by receivers, as well as throwaways by quarterbacks, and a few other stats that are proprietary, to figure out what we call the independent quarterback rating. So what was the quarterback responsible for his quarterback rating? It's on the same scale as quarterback rating, but it's not going to penalize him for the defensive back that dropped his interception. That's just going to be an incomplete pass for him. And different changes like that allow you to understand maybe a little bit more about what the quarterback was responsible. So that's a big thing when we talk about stats. It's not only rate stats, but being able to assign responsibility. And then there are individual stats, and you want to control a lot of those for the quality of opponent. There's some interesting methods that we're doing right now where you compare one-on-one battles, and through a series of one-on-one battles, you can figure out who would be expected to win a battle between two people that have never played anybody before. So if I line up against a defensive tackle, and that defensive tackle lines up against another offensive guard, and that offensive guard in 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, we can figure out who would be expected to win each matchup. And then we can even figure out, based on contextual factors having to do with the players and the player archetypes, where that will apply and where that won't apply using clustering. And the one thing I'll mention is there's a new stat that's uncomfortable. Compare it to the league average, and you get a pretty good sense of what the player's doing. Where are our stats strongest? Where the longest historical trail of data is. Quarterback, receiver, running back, it's the strongest data, sure. But we're weakest on special teams, and there's a lot of untapped potential, but less of a market for it. Our most interesting stuff for sure is defense and line play. in my opinion. I think that stuff is really mostly untapped historically, and we have some really great things that go into that that make learning the number of tackles that a person had, I think, kind of trivial almost at the end of the day. But along with everything else that we're doing, it's in a young stage of development, and we're in this for the long haul. Your question?
Yeah. How do you distinguish? All right, so you got a guy that's the same play, a 3rd and 7 for a cornerback. If he's got a 7-yard out on 1st and on 3rd and 1 and 3rd and 10, 2 different things, but it's the same play.
Right.
How can you distinguish?
Right.
How?
So this is a great question, and that's a great question, and there are a lot of ways to answer that. And I'll start off with how Ben Alamar at ESPN, who invented QBR, invented his way to answer it. And what he said is he's going to assign whether or not it was a successful play as being an input into his algorithm. So a 1st and 10, let's take a better example. A 1st and 10 3-yard gain versus a 2nd and 1 3-yard gain. Those are monumentally different results, right? What he does is he considers the 2nd and 1 a successful play, and if you're making less than 5 yards on 1st down, he's considering it an unsuccessful play. So that gets built into the algorithm, and then he can know not to assign you as much credit for that. Now, a 6-yard completion on 3rd and 7, he's killing you for that in that formula. It's 10,000 lines of code that I haven't been able to read all the way through, but he accounts for it his own way. My preferred way to account for it, for every down and distance and yard line in a football game, there's an expected points that a team would score. If we look at every team over the last 10 years that had 1st and 10 on the 20, we can find the number of points that team scored on average. Say they scored 4 points on average on that drive, right? Now, say they make a 5-yard gain on that 1st down. 2nd and 5 on the 25 sounds a little bit better than 1st and 10 on the 20, but did they really change that much? We might look at our formulas and see now they have 4.1 expected points on that drive. That's one way to get at value. If a play created 0.1 expected points, you have a pretty good sense that that's a positive play. Now, where does that fall down? 4th quarter. Because in 4th quarter, you might not be trying to create points. That becomes less of your goal at that point. You might be playing against the clock. So now we talk about win probabilities. And there are different models that you can use. But I think as you get later in a game, it becomes important to consider how the win probability is changing based on the results of the play. And really, those are my 2 preferred methods. You could probably argue with the 9 or so people in the world that have thought about it as much as I have about which way would be the best way to do it. But for sure, we need to account for what you're talking about.
So, but I guess when you're talking about trying to evaluate the quality of a player based on a certain set of statistics, I just feel like it's vastly different than baseball when you're thinking about how many different people impact the play, especially on defense, at least as I'm listening to you talk. So you're saying that same cornerback, that same 10-yard out on a 3rd and 3, we're not taking into fact, there was a sack, but the quarterback slipped out because it's Russell Wilson as opposed to Tom Brady or something like that.
Right.
How that quarterback is now being evaluated is something that is difficult to quantify for him.
No, you're on it. You're on it. Okay. This is the grand picture, all right? Because you're 100%. You're poking all the holes that exist in what's being done that a lot of people are doing. Let's start with a couple things. I talked about basketball a little bit before, and plus minus, right? Mm-hmm. Could you think about what I was just talking about with expected points and think about that as a plus minus? So if we're creating points on a play, my 11 guys, we had a plus, right? Like we made a 2-point basket, that's +2 for everybody that was on the court, right? So we get that 1st down gain that increases our expected points. Say we gain 1 expected point, those 11 guys. Okay, now we figured out we added a point. Now let's figure out amongst those 11 guys who was responsible. This gets a lot more difficult and we have to make a lot more assumptions now. You might want to stop right there if you're not confident in your ability to break things down further, but I think you can. If on a play, a defensive end came unblocked, we do something where we say quarterback avoids. So Aaron Rodgers can get sacked, and that's the end of the play. And based on my experience, it's probably his left tackle's fault if it was coming around over there. But sometimes we see Aaron Rodgers avoid the sack. He's creating points without, even if nothing good happens on the play, he could be creating points because he's eliminating those negative points. So all of these things you can account for if you get really good specific data and you can trust computer algorithms, because it's a jump, and I know that, but machine learning is powerful. and it can take a lot of situations and put a lot of factors into context in ways that seem unrealistic. And yet at the same time, Vegas keeps beating me. And there's a reason why, and it's because this stuff works. And it works in almost every other business. But that's a great question, and that's the challenge. You've identified the challenge for sure. Yeah?
Going along his lines, I'm assuming your company does this, but what is the value of, I guess, unit-based characteristics on each of those things? So like, your example right now was defensive end blew by, so left tackle's fault. Aaron Rodgers makes the escape. What if the responsibility was on the running back for his pass fake? This is what's right? Or his
right.
What kind of assignment? I'm sure you don't get into it too much, but unit-based, or like all of the offensive line versus all of the receivers versus all of the defensive line. Do you guys have unit-based measurements that also take that into account?
Exactly. So the first step to figuring out assigning responsibility is dividing up the units and figuring out how each unit performed on the play. And then from there, you can figure out other things. But what you're saying is totally true. I can run a perfect out and up route and be wide open, and the ball might not get thrown to me. And somebody else could run a perfect post corner on the other side and score a touchdown, and I don't get any points. Like, trust me, when I was playing high school football, that happened all the time.
That gentleman was perfect on one side of the field versus the coverage being blown in the secondary, and the responsibility wasn't the guy who got scored on and saw, but it was the safety who did everything over the top.
So this is the difference between figuring out what happened and predicting what's going to happen. In figuring out what happened, it gets a little messy when you really try to like dole out responsibility for individual things and make it all add up to one. That's one way to look at things, and a lot of people are very comfortable with that. It's like win shares is a similar concept to that. But really what we're tasked with doing is using what happened to figure out what's going to happen. And when you start to break down the granular events and you just figure out if it was a good route or it was a bad route, if he created separation or if he didn't, that stuff, you can still look at that whether he got the ball thrown to him or not. And you can figure that, and you can look at that over a large amount of time. And if you're coaching your team right, you can leverage the players that are performing well into good performances by using them correctly. But this is all interrelated, and the last thing I'd ever want anybody to do is give you the impression that it's not. Yeah?
I don't disagree that analytics have a spot in football, but would you agree or just acknowledge maybe that sometimes there are certain plays where stats or analytics just can't be taken into account? For instance, there was a study in tape the other day of CU, and they had a cornerback, Wusier, and I forget who they were playing, but he was like 3rd and 7. All game they had thrown out routes on this kid, right at the sticks, kept gaining yards on him. Finally, he jumps a route, 3rd and 7. It's an out and up. He gets beat. I think it's for a touchdown. But he recognized it down a distance. He jumped it. He had a good break. The guy just threw a double move on him. And at that point, I was kind of trying to determine, what do I grade? What do I say about it? I mean, he knew down the distance. He acknowledged it. He had a good jump. He got beat because they threw a double move on him. But regularly, that's a good play. So at that point, what kind of thing would you assign, or what kind of grade or point system? What would you say about that?
So there's a few interesting things going on. One, I might contend your notion that he made a good play getting beat on the double move, even if he was doing what he should have been doing and he was taking account for things. At the end of the day, if you're looking at any sort of results-based analytics, it's going to come back to that double move and the fact that he gave up a touchdown. So we can account for him only giving 5 yards on 3rd and 7, and we'd actually call that a good play. Forget about a completion, check mark, or any of that sort of stuff. That's not the level that our stats are getting at, and those are bad stats. And I will say that there are bad stats, and they piss me off more than anything because they are undercutting my business, my life. Bad stats ruin it for everybody. The other thing that I would talk about is process versus outcome. A lot of other sports are, baseball specifically, because they're so far ahead, they're transferring from results-based analysis to process-based analysis. So instead of saying, was it a hit, was it an out, was it an error, they're now saying, what was the speed off the bat and what was the trajectory? And if you hit it with that bat speed and that trajectory, we expect you to have a line drive this amount of time. Forget about what happened after the ball went into play. We care about finding the guys that hit the ball with that trajectory, with that speed. That's what you're talking about. The corner that played the out correctly, that sat on it when he should have sat on it. If you feel confident as a scout that he did that correctly, and that every time you watch it, you say, you know what, he got beat this time, but I wouldn't tell him to do it differently at all. That's good football by him. Then for sure, I mean, there's nothing you can say about that, and that's why process-based scouting is going to be a frontier that's going to be really exciting. Next gen is really in an early stage. Even the teams only have access to their own stuff, so they don't even have the team that they're playing against when they look at next gen data. There are literally 11, not even 22 guys on the field, and that's the teams. So you got some media doing things telling you miles per hour and things like that, which I think is going to be great to replace a 40-yard dash time, see how fast they're actually going on the field. But we're not getting a lot of really useful stuff out of that. And to be honest, that's probably a few yards away. But that said, by using that kind of stuff, we can get at what a corner's range is, right? So when he's in cover 3, we need to draw that little circle around him based on the radar, and we can know what his range is versus other guys. Another Earl Thomas tidbit, his is really big. Does that help? How are we doing on time, Neil? Should I keep rolling through some more? Are there more questions? Okay.
Why don't you pick a couple more of the ones that we have here? Just finish up.
Yeah, okay, so we'll finish up on a few more of these. Football's not as cut and dry as other sports. How do you develop metrics for offensive linemen and other positions? I think we just really hit on that pretty well. I don't think it'll ever be as predictive as other sports. We have sample size issues. We have multiples of team culture factors that are much more important in our sport than in other sports. I think even the other sports would acknowledge that based on people that I've talked to. And then there are teammate and coach effects that are impossible to account for. Now, opponent effects is something that we haven't really touched on yet, and that's something that's really important to me. Because certain people that like to grade players, they often don't take into account if you were going against a schlub or if you're going against the best left tackle in the league. And to me, that's incredibly important. So a lot of what we do to try to get at that is there are statistical tools and procedures that you use where, again, you can account for things that haven't happened yet and predict how they're going to happen in the future based on these battles in the past. So instead of rewarding somebody for beating Minnesota's left tackle, you might actually get a demerit for beating that left tackle and not getting to the quarterback as quickly as you should have, because that guy couldn't get out of his stance all season. So if everybody else got a sack against that guy and you didn't get a sack against that guy, but you think you had just a fine game, our stats would actually knock you for that. Whereas somebody doing a subjective evaluation, they might actually say, oh, he had a good game. He performed at a 75%, not bad. We would say, yeah, everybody else that went against that left tackle had a 95%, to put it into that language. So teammate effects are something else that we account for that's really interesting. Do I see war rooms being dominated by SIS data? NFL teams have had data and analytics forever. They didn't use that name for it, but things have always been broken down and charted, and every coach has their own system and their own way of doing things. This stuff can get confusing, but I wouldn't let the growing pains get in the way of improvement, because I think there are real improvements that can be made, especially when we have real football people talk with real math people and bring their minds together. Right now at the end of the draft, I can tell you from being in 2 different draft rooms, at the end of the draft, 7th round's ending, everybody's trying to figure out their priority free agents, something near and dear to your guys' hearts, right? They're looking at cards that have the height, weight, and speed of these players in big, bold print, and the grades on the reports in little letters, and other factors about them in little letters, and then maybe a sticker for if they have bad character or if they have a medical problem. That's pretty much it, right? So at the end of the draft, people are running around. You see people that have been spending 30, 40 years of their career in football, and they're looking at these tags and they're saying, I don't know, 4.42, that's pretty good considering we don't have to spend a draft pick on him. And yeah, I get it, but where do I see draft rooms going in the future? I see them using numbers on the card that are actually predictive of success. It's so silly to me that we're doing things that way, and it's understandable, and it's people looking out for themselves, a little bit of CYA. When you say, hey, we're looking for a corner, this dude's fast, he's tall, let's bring him in, let's give him a shot. You wouldn't believe how much, especially in the old school, that's what they rely on more than their eyes. And they act like they don't believe in analytics, but the fact of the matter is they do, and they believe in the wrong analytics. They believe in a 40-yard dash time from the underwear Olympics. And And what we're really doing is tracking how well they played football games and accounting for the quality opponent and what the field type was that day and what your teammate did and sometimes even what your coaches called. So where do I see it going? I see 3 much better numbers at the top of the card, hopefully. We have a lot of products I can talk about. I don't know how much that interests people in the room. A lot of teams that we're offering products to in college football and pro football are customizable feeds and an API. We have something called the SIS Data Hub, which is our new online stat portal, which actually might be of interest to you. I'll talk about in a minute. We have integrated video solutions, so you can use our data to create a cut-up of anything that's one of our data points. So say you want to see a receiver and you want to see all of his targets and to get a better sense of what's going on with him, or say you wanted to see specifically every time he ran a post route or every time he ran against cover 2 coverage, whatever sort of thing you want like that, or a post route against cover 2 coverage. You can make that cut up easily. We do next-gen solutions, next-gen data, like I said before. It's struggling right now. There's a lot of teleporting going on with players jumping around and things like that. Our data is great for helping to merge with that and understand what's going on a little bit better. And then finally, analytics services and reports. We're working with teams on developing a lot of different reports. We're doing some special team stuff right now, and we're excited about it. On the agent side, with baseball, historically, we do a lot of work with the agents and specifically the Players Association. They use our tools. They have a stat portal that they use for baseball that, from what I understand, is not even close to as good as the stat portal that we've built for football. So we're really excited about the football stat portal, and in the upcoming weeks and months, we're talking about figuring out a way to market that to agents in case they wanted to get a sense of maybe their own players for individual reports in terms of negotiating a new contract or recruiting and finding something on players to give you a leg up in college, or finding the hidden gems in underclassmen, because we're not doing anything illegal with underclassmen, we're just telling you how well they played. So that combined with some of the height, weight, speed stuff that I hate so much that we can kind of insert into our algorithms can be pretty predictive about what success you'll have. And especially 3 years from now, when we have a longitudinal set of data for that, we're really excited about the way that we can improve draft prediction accuracy. All right. I'll go to the last question so we can wrap up. As a former scout, how do you see the NFL scouting evolving as analytics become more integrated into front offices? Do you see analytics replacing scouts or reducing their roles? And I just want to say, my boss, the day I walked into my job, I said to him, you know, this analytics stuff, it's new to me. I'm a real scout. And he says, trust me, scouting plus analytics is much better than either scouting or analytics. I'm never going to ask you for one day to stop being a scout. We need you to bring the scouts and the analytics together so that we can get the sum of the parts, the whole to be more than the sum of the parts. And that's been what I've found. Andrew Hawkins is a guy that I talked to. He's a short wide receiver. He just got cut by the Browns. He's a friend of mine he's also in the Columbia Sports Management program. Really sharp guy. He's a very short wide receiver who didn't get really a sniff out of college, went to the CFL and eventually made it in the NFL and has made 8 figures over his career. He said to me, how do you account for this? When I was in high school, the game was really hard. In college, it got easier. In the CFL, it got easier. And in the pros, it got really easy for me. And yet, from each of those levels, nobody thought I could make it to the next level because I was 5'9" and 170 pounds. How do you explain that? I said, Hawk, I have no idea how to explain that, but that's one of the most interesting things I've ever heard. But one thing that we do with clusters is we start to figure out archetypes and different types of players that share traits with each other and how they might develop over time. And I said, Hawk, we don't have an answer right now, but I would love to work with you on figuring it out so that 10 years from now, all those other Andrew Hawkins aren't getting slept on anymore, and they're in the mainstream. So he thought, man, analytics stink because all these guys just want big, strong, fast, and it's going to kill players like me. And I said, no, bad analytics are going to do that. Good analytics are going to get the best players on the field. In baseball, the guys who are quote-unquote less athletic are now playing a bigger role in the game because of analytics. So it doesn't always work in the direction that it might seem to on the top of your head. A couple other things. Moore's Law, it's slowing down a little bit right now, but technology doubles every 2 years. So the amount of data that we have in football is doubling every 2 years. And it's accelerating beyond that in some cases because of next gen. This stuff's real and it's here to stay. There's little way around that. We're here to make scouting better, not to replace it. I hate bad stats. I don't want to replace scouts, but bad stats give a bad name to all of us. When I read that Alex Mack wasn't good on Cleveland and then he was good on Atlanta because that's what somebody said on a grading thing, I think it's absolutely ridiculous because I have eyes and I saw Alex Mack play in Cleveland and I know that he was a damn good player. So bad stats are maybe the most counterproductive thing because they can lead to attitudes where you get very skeptical of the analytics. And I would caution you to just kind of know your sources when you're reading this stuff. And look around the world, look at every sport. The games are changing as new strategies are being involved. If you look at the Cubs in baseball, they just built a dynasty on analytics. The Warriors have taken advantage of the rule in basketball that 3 points is more than 2 by 50% to a ridiculous degree. And like I said before, Real Madrid, even in soccer, has increased their efficiency on taking corner kicks. If you're ever watching a soccer game again and somebody takes a corner kick and it's an outswinger as opposed to an in-swinger, then you can just shake your head at them and know that you know more about soccer strategy than they do already, because the numbers are staggering on just a simple thing like that, even though a soccer person will tell you, but an outswinger looks prettier. It's a prettier looking goal. So it might not always be pretty, but we can help make better decisions. So you can either jump on the bandwagon or watch it go by. Thanks for listening to me. So hope I didn't bore you too much. If you want to talk to me afterwards, I'll be here, and I'm happy to meet you. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
No, I had to ask more questions.
Yeah.
So you're talking about like 50,000 hours to analyze video and things like that. And they've been doing some people with computer vision, machine learning, analyzing the football footage, right? And NBA, they've been working on that. Is that any good yet, or do you see that coming along, or what's the big gap with that?
They've made the most advance in the NBA with it. The hard thing is players, what orientation. That's going to be a big thing towards figuring that out, because it's very easy to tell if a player is moving from one XY coordinate to another. It's more difficult to tell what direction that he's facing, and to get a really good sense of like what direction that might predict that he's moving in. So the directional stuff gets tough in that sense. That said, in the NBA, they've made a lot of progress. The Toronto Raptors have even developed a program where they, based on their defensive scheme, figured out wherever the ball is and wherever the 5 offensive players are, they programmed in where the defensive players should be standing, and they can actually coach up their defense based on what their video reading is of where their players are standing versus what the video suggestion of where they should be standing based on the defensive scheme is. So they do some things with that, and they've made more progress in basketball. The indoor stadium and all the stadiums being the same really helps there. But in football, it's a little bit further behind. But for sure, with doing video learning stuff on actually just taking the video and learning things, some things right now are being learned, but a lot of the finer points, they have issues with the grass and with when there's shade going in one direction and stuff like that. So, and then, you know, if you can get a video to tell me about which offensive lineman is playing with proper hand use, then that's some pretty good stuff you got there. Yes?
What was your aha moment? Like for me, I'm from NFL Draft Bible, so for me, like Zach Thomas, I had a first-round grade on him, and he went in the 4th round, so I was like, aha. You know, what was your aha moment?
That's an interesting question. What was my aha moment? I mean, my aha moment was when I was reading Moneyball, and I realized, wait, there's more to this that applies than I ever realized. And then I've since had about 1,000 aha moments, and I've averaged a couple per day. I can't say there's one player that has made me believe that. I would say this: scouting, as it relates to the analytics, I think is going to be the most strong when we can be really strong about defining our scout, what we're scouting for, defining accuracy, defining arm strength, defining pocket presence and these sorts of skills, because I think ultimately it's the skills that make the player and not the events that happen, and that's why we get back to that process-based stuff. But so for me, what is it? I've always had a sort of quarterback archetype that I've liked, and when you do research and you really start to pull out the traits with quarterbacks that project to NFL success, it turns out that accuracy has a lot more to do with arm strength. And then when I look back on that one, a little bit like Zach Thomas being really good at tackling people as opposed to being tall, makes him a good linebacker. All of a sudden, looking at that, you start to see which quarterbacks actually make it in the NFL and which quarterbacks don't make it in the NFL. That lines up a lot of the time. That's a really big one. Our accuracy is a requisite. Arm strength, as long as you can throw it outside the numbers on a 15-yard out, it's pretty much a bonus. And even Chad Pennington can prove to you that you can be successful without that. So improving kind of which of the traits are actually important and predictive and we should care about as evaluators, I think that's a little bit of the aha.
How significant and or important is any one play? I guess I would put that in perspective. Think about a defensive end that comes out, that's a third down specialist. He comes out 7 plays, he's got 3 sacks. He looks like he's best in the league, but he's not playing first and second down. He doesn't have the same fatigue, and or he gets out in or another defensive end that has played so much. At this point, it's they've got a scheme that they're trying to do. So do they like throw out the outliers like they do in diving or something, where they throw out some plays that they're not included?
So what we do is we say, how are you defining success? And so there's some different things. There's volume. So how many plays are you in for and how well you produce on those plays? There's also some situational things. Vic Beasley's a great example of a guy, a third down pass rusher, came in, did amazing stuff in those situations. So I might want to create one sort of metric where I look at third down pass rushing and I evaluate in that way to see all those guys in that situation, how they did. And then I might want to also compare that to their usage rate. And a lot of times what you find is that efficiency and usage kind of have an inverse relationship. And as somebody's usage goes up, their efficiency goes down. So it's something to be careful about. Usually I'm interested in efficiency. That tends to be the way that analysts like to look at things. But one, you should be careful about a really efficient player that was only in on 7 plays, like you said, because the sample size isn't there. Or he's fresh and going against somebody else that isn't fresh. But then on kind of the opposite side of the coin, you should not ignore people that are really efficient in small sample sizes, because a lot of sports have histories of showing that good players in small sample sizes, when given larger sample sizes, depending on the archetype of player, they sometimes project to perform just as well at a high level. So if you think about Allen Iverson was never a high efficiency player. He was a very high usage player. No matter what his usage was, his efficiency was going to be about the same. Jordan, high efficiency player, high usage player. If you changed his usage, his efficiency would stay the same. Somebody like Stephon Marbury was high efficiency when he was low usage, and he was low efficiency when he was high usage. And you can start to pinpoint these things when you start to figure out which traits that they have in common that are actually relevant to predicting how they're going to perform. Yeah, it's fun, right?
All right.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right, guys, thanks for coming out tonight. I want to thank Steve, of course, for hosting, and Leon as well. I want to thank Canyon and Matt, of course, for speaking. I really appreciate you guys, too, for coming out. I think we're going to adjourn to the Ram. Probably get there maybe 15 or 20 minutes. You're all welcome to join us. Thanks again for coming out.
Thank you, Neil.